there is a singular moment, quiet, almost humiliating in its simplicity, when the ordinary world slips and reveals its architecture. Not a thunderclap, not a vision. Sometimes it happens in a grocery aisle, in the middle of a conversation, in the dull glow of a phone screen at 2:13 a.m., and yet, in that moment, something crosses a perceptual threshold. Your attention touches the edge of an ontological foundation, and the mundane, for one breath, stops being just life and becomes a disclosure. You realize the world has been speaking in two languages at once. The first is the language we are trained to hear: surfaces, schedules, names, outcomes. The second is older and more subterranean: pattern, symbol, presence, what the perennial philosophers called the one, the monad, the hidden unity behind the many. And here is the strange, irreversible law of this threshold. Once you perceive it, you cannot return to innocence. Awakening, if we are disciplined with the term, is not the acquisition of new information. It is not spiritual data. It is not a collection of beliefs, aesthetics, or metaphysical vocabulary. Awakening is a subtraction, a removal, the stripping away of veils that were never truly part of reality, only part of your conditioned perception of it. This is why it feels both liberating and destabilizing. You don't simply learn something, you lose something. The ability to fully believe the world is only what it appears to be. Think of an optical illusion, the kind where at first you see only random shapes. Then someone points out the hidden image, a face inside the shadows, a figure inside the negative space, and suddenly the image locks in. The mind reorganizes itself around what it has seen. From that moment on, you can try to look away. You can pretend it isn't there, but you cannot unsee it. This is the ontological shift. When the mundane reveals the monad. When the everyday stops being merely functional and becomes transparently symbolic, almost lit from within. And in this episode, I'm not going to sell you a fantasy of instant enlightenment. I'm going to map the mechanics of the threshold itself. What actually changes in perception, why the world begins to look coded, and how to stabilize this shift without turning it into superstition, paranoia, or escapism. Because the promise here is not spectacle. The promise is precision. By the end, you'll have a clear framework for recognizing the moment the veil thins. When reality stops behaving like an object and starts behaving like a mirror. And how to step across that threshold consciously, without losing your grounding, your discernment, or your peace. Begin with the simplest object within reach. A coffee cup, a chair, your own breath moving in and out like a quiet metronome. The mind calls these things solid because the nervous system must. Solidity is a survival interpretation, an interface that keeps you from walking through fire or forgetting where the edge of the staircase is. But the academic bridge begins precisely where intuition breaks, at the level of the small. Modern physics tells us that what you experience as solid is not solidity in any literal sense. It is relationship, fields and forces negotiating boundaries. At the subatomic scale, contact is not two hard objects colliding like billiard balls. It is a choreography of electromagnetic repulsion, probability distributions, and quantum constraints. In plain terms, the hand does not meet the cup the way your senses narrate it. There is no dense, continuous substance called cupness that your fingers press against. There is mostly space, structured into stability by interaction. The cup feels solid because your body is translating invisible dynamics into a usable world. And now the esoteric synthesis becomes almost unavoidable. If the foundation of matter is not stuff, but patterned energy and lawful interaction, then the old division between the physical and the spiritual begins to look less like a truth, and more like a perceptual limitation, a boundary condition. Something designed not for metaphysical accuracy but for evolutionary utility. We did not evolve to perceive reality as it is. We evolved to perceive reality as it must appear in order for a fragile organism to survive. This is not mystical rhetoric. It's a sober epistemological point. Your senses are not windows. They are filters. They deliver a functional map, not the territory. And if the map prioritizes survival, then it will exaggerate separation. It will insist on edges. It will render the world as objects rather than as a single, continuous field. Because a creature that perceives everything as one undivided process is not necessarily a creature that remembers to eat, to flee, to build shelter. So what we call physical may simply be the spiritual rendered in low resolution. The ancients said it differently, but not necessarily less precisely. Across wisdom traditions, whether in the language of the One, the Tao, Brahman, the Akasha, spirit, ase, prana, pneuma, there is a persistent claim. Beneath the apparent multiplicity of forms, there is a singular substratum, not a thing but a principle, not an object but a presence. The many are expressions. The one is the ground. Here is the thesis stated cleanly. The coffee cup, the chair, and the breath are not fundamentally different categories of being. They are different arrangements of the same underlying energy, condensed into form, stabilized by law, and interpreted by the nervous system as separateness. To call one material and the other spiritual is to confuse the interface for the source. Matter is spirit at a slower frequency. Spirit is matter before it is named. And when this lands, not as a belief, but as a perception, the world changes texture. Objects begin to feel less like isolated things and more like temporary coherences within a larger continuum. The cup is no longer merely a cup. It is a local pattern in the same field that animates your lungs, your thoughts, your memories, your longing. The divide collapses, not because you learned a new concept, but because you stop mistaking the veil for reality. There is an old axiom that survives every century's attempt to bury it. The universe repeats itself, not as superstition but as structure. In the Hermetic tradition, this appears as the axiom of correspondence. As above, so below. As below, so above. The claim is not that the cosmos is a poetic metaphor for human life, but that reality is fractal in principle. Patterns echo across scales. The atom and the solar system, the neuron and the constellation, the psyche and the polis. Different theaters, one grammar. Hermes Trismegistus, that liminal figure where myth and philosophy interlace, becomes less a wizard in this light and more a proto-epistemologist. Someone arguing that knowledge is not merely accumulated from the outside, but recognized through resonance between inner and outer orders. And then, without forcing the analogy, we arrive at a strange modern parallel. In quantum physics, the observer is not a neutral spectator. Measurement does not simply report reality. It participates in how reality is registered. The so-called observer effect has been sensationalized in pop culture, but the sober philosophical implication remains. The relationship between knower and known is not cleanly separable. Observation is not an innocent act. Hermeticism would nod at this, not because ancient texts predicted quantum mechanics, but because both are pointing to the same epistemic fracture. The world you experience is not independent of the mode of attention that experiences it. So why, if this correspondence is so intuitively powerful, does it remain peripheral in modern discourse? Because it threatens the default religion of the era, the belief that reality is entirely external, entirely objective, and entirely manageable by institutional authority. To admit correspondence is to admit meaning. To admit meaning is to admit that consciousness is not a late-stage accident, it is a participant in the order of things. And that destabilizes the modern contract. A culture can tolerate many kinds of ignorance, but it struggles to tolerate the idea that the citizen might discover a direct relationship to truth that does not require permission. This is where the epistemological conflict becomes psychological. We live inside what could be called a collective hypnosis, a shared trance of assumptions, that the visible is the real, that the measurable is the meaningful, that the inner world is subjective and therefore disposable. This trance is not accidental. It is reinforced through systematic conditioning, education that prizes memorization over insight, media that trades depth for stimulation, and social rewards that favor conformity over contemplation. In such an environment, correspondence becomes dangerous, because once you see pattern, You stop being easily governed by noise. And yet, through every era, there are intellectual rebels who seem to touch information from angles that do not fit the standard map. Nikola Tesla is often described as someone who saw inventions whole, complete systems arriving as inner images, later translated into engineering. Albert Einstein, in his own way, emphasized thought experiments, intuition, and imaginative symmetry, approaching physics not only as calculation, but as a kind of conceptual listening for what must be true beneath appearances. Now we should be disciplined here. This is not the claim that they were mystics in lab coats, or that genius requires the paranormal. It is something subtler and more disturbing. It is the suggestion that the human mind has access to channels of knowing that extend beyond conventional frameworks. Intuition, pattern recognition at depth, symbolic insight, sudden synthesis. Modes of cognition our culture uses, then immediately distrusts, because they cannot be standardized, monetized, or neatly credentialed. And that is the lineage of hidden knowledge, not a secret society behind a curtain, but a recurring human capacity that keeps resurfacing whenever someone becomes quiet enough, disciplined enough, and brave enough to look beyond the permitted consensus. Because the real esoteric tradition is not about hiding truth from the masses. It is about remembering that truth is not only collected, it is also revealed when the observer becomes coherent enough to perceive it. At a certain point, philosophy must descend from the throne of ideas and become method. Otherwise, awakening remains a private aesthetic, beautiful but inert. So let us name the practical hinge of this work with precision. Operational consciousness is the transition from unconscious participation in reality to deliberate participation. And this is where the word manifestation requires rehabilitation. In the popular imagination, manifestation is treated like metaphysical bribery. Think the right thoughts, speak the right incantations, and reality obediently rearranges itself. That is not scholarship, it is witchcraft. A more disciplined definition is this: manifestation is the interaction of consciousness with a field of possibilities. Not magic as violation of law, but mind as selection and stabilization. Within lawful constraints. Attention shaping perception. Perception shaping behavior. Behavior shaping environment. And environment feeding back into the mind. A loop, a living circuit. In other words, the field of possibilities is not merely external. It includes your physiology, your habits, your interpretive frames, and the probability pathways you repeatedly reinforce. Consciousness does not float above matter. It moves through it, as pattern moves through a medium. This is why the empirical bridge matters. Across contemporary mind-body research, there is a growing interest in the measurable links between internal states and biological markers, heart rate, variability, stress hormones, immune-related signals, and neural changes that accompany sustained contemplative practice. Dr. Joe Dispenza is one of the more visible public figures in this space, pointing to physiological data collected around intensive, retreat-style meditation and collaborations. He describes with academic partners. Now, because we are being both mystical and academic, we must keep two truths in the same hand. Meditative practice can correlate with measurable biological changes. This is broadly supported across the wider contemplative science landscape. Specific claims and interpretations vary in rigor, and Dispenza's public-facing conclusions have also drawn criticism for overstating what existing evidence can justify. So we keep what is useful without surrendering discernment. The credible takeaway is not thought overrides physics, but something more consequential and grounded. Inner states have signatures, and signatures have downstream effects, which brings us to the agency shift, the real alchemy of operational consciousness. Most people live as if causality is a one-way arrow. External conditions, internal state. Traffic happens, the nervous system spikes. A message arrives, the mood collapses. A bill appears, peace disappears. The world acts, the self reacts. Operational consciousness reverses the primary driver. Internal state, perception, choice, outcome. This does not mean you control everything. It means you stop granting the external world the status of first cause inside your mind. You begin to understand that your state is not a decoration. It is an engine. Your baseline emotional chemistry, your attentional discipline, the coherence or incoherence of your nervous system, these aren't just private experiences. They are causal forces. They determine what you notice, what you interpret as possible, what risks you tolerate, what patterns you repeat, and what opportunities you unconsciously refuse. So manifestation in its mature form is not the demand that reality obey your desires. It is the art of becoming the kind of being through whom a higher order of reality can actually move, not accidental, not superstitious, not dependent on mood, deliberate. When this work matures, it does not culminate in visions. It culminates in integration. The final stage is not an escape from the ordinary world, but the dissolution of the boundary that made the ordinary world seem spiritually irrelevant in the first place. The wall between practice and life collapses, not because life becomes theatrical, but because you stop living in fragments. At the beginning, spirituality is scheduled. It is something you do. Meditation in the morning, breathwork at night, a book, a ritual, a lecture. And then the day begins, emails, traffic, invoices, conversations, and the sacred is packed away like a garment reserved for special occasions. But the awakening you are describing is an ontological shift, and it refuses to remain compartmentalized, because once the veils are subtracted, you begin to perceive that consciousness is not something you generate only on a cushion. It is what you are, and therefore it permeates every moment in which you exist. Practice stops being a location and becomes a mode of being. This is the sacred mundane, the recognition that the divine does not arrive only when conditions are quiet and candles are lit. It arrives, more accurately, it is recognized in the middle of the mundane, precisely because the mundane is where your consciousness is tested, refined, and made real. The sacred mundane is not poetic sentiment. It is a functional realization. Washing dishes becomes a study of attention. A difficult conversation becomes a laboratory of self-mastery. Standing in line becomes training in presence. The breath becomes a threshold between the formless and the formed, repeating without your permission like a silent scripture. You begin to see that spiritual practice was never meant to be a separate activity. It was meant to retrain perception so thoroughly that every activity becomes practice. And with that comes a subtle but decisive ethical shift. Because if there is no real wall between your inner world and the world you inhabit, then your state is no longer private. Your coherence or your chaos spills outward. Your moods become atmosphere. Your attention becomes influence. Your nervous system becomes a tuning fork that either destabilizes the room or stabilizes it. So enlightenment stops being a personal achievement and becomes a responsibility. Not a moral burden, something cleaner. A recognition that your presence participates in the reality others must live inside. This is why the great traditions, at their deepest, do not measure awakening by experiences but by embodiment. Patience, clarity, restraint, courage, gentleness, truthfulness. Not because virtue earns spiritual status, but because virtue is the natural signature of a consciousness no longer at war with itself. And here's the synthesis stated plainly. When the wall falls, there is no ordinary time left. There is only the moment you are in, revealing its depth, according to the quality of your attention. The sacred is not elsewhere. It is not future. It is not reserved for perfect conditions. It is hidden in the texture of what you already touch. Coffee cup, chair, breath, waiting for the perceiver, who has crossed the threshold to finally recognize the monad has been here the whole time. So let us end with a correction, gentle but absolute. The goal was never transcendence in the popular sense, an escape from matter, an exit from the human condition, a spiritual evacuation plan. That impulse often disguises itself as holiness, but it is frequently just fatigue, an understandable desire to flee the weight of living. The deeper aim is embodiment, not leaving the world but illuminating it from within, not rejecting form, but using form as a vessel through which essence can become visible, through speech that heals rather than harms, through work that carries integrity, through presence that stabilizes rather than destabilizes. Because if matter is not the enemy, if the mundane is a sacred interface, then the question of awakening becomes almost simple. Can the infinite express itself through your finite day? Can the formless move through your schedule, your relationships, your responsibilities, your decisions? Can your inner realization become a lived texture? This is why the sages measure realization by what it produces. Coherence, clarity, compassion, courage, restraint, depth, not as moral decoration, but as evidence that the wall has truly fallen. And here is the final closing thought to hold like a seal. You are not a separate self trying to reach spirit. You are spirit, a singular consciousness, learning itself through the vehicle of human experience, through limitation, through sensation, through heartbreak and beauty, through forgetting and remembrance, through the ordinary objects that, once seen rightly, become translucent with meaning. The monad did not come to reject the many. The monad came to discover itself as the many. So if you have crossed the threshold, if the mundane has begun to reveal the hidden unity, then don't ask how to escape this world. Ask how to inhabit it with precision. Ask how to become the kind of human through whom the real can speak. If this resonated, if you've ever felt that singular moment when reality flickers and the veil thins, comment embodiment below. And if you want more episodes that bridge mystical insight with disciplined, scholarly clarity, subscribe and join this ongoing exploration of the ontological shift, where the everyday becomes the doorway and the human becomes the instrument of the infinite. Remember, family, your awakening is part of this collective unfolding. Until next time, Universal Consciousness signing out.